Isabella Moreau was born into a world of opulence. She grew up surrounded by grand parties, designer dresses, and lavish vacations on private islands. She never worried about money, about the future, or about anything beyond choosing what to wear for the evening's gala. The Moreau estate stood in the heart of London, a majestic mansion with towering marble columns and glittering crystal chandeliers. Every inch of the house screamed wealth, from the priceless artwork lining the walls to the exquisite wine glasses reserved for extravagant dinners. Since childhood, Isabella had known only indulgence. Mornings were spent sipping tea at the Ritz, afternoons browsing Bond Street's finest boutiques, and evenings attending galas where she mingled with the city's elite. Her life was wrapped in luxury and frivolity, making her believe that she would always have a choice, that the world would always open its doors to her. But what Isabella didn't know was that it was all an illusion. Her family had been drowning in debt for years. The luxury cars, the extravagant soirees, everything was sustained by a mountain of unpaid loans. She had no idea that every diamond on her neck was a fragment of a debt she never knew existed. Until one day, the illusion shattered. Her parents summoned her to the grand sitting room, their faces tense. The chandelier above sparkled, but it couldn't dispel the heavy silence that filled the air. "Isabella, you have to get married." Her mother's voice trembled. Isabella laughed, thinking it was a joke, but when she saw the way her parents avoided her gaze, an eerie chill ran down her spine. She had never imagined that one day she would be sold like an object at auction. Isabella sat frozen in her chair, her heart hammering against her ribs. "Marriage?" she echoed, as if saying it aloud would make it sound even more absurd. Her father exhaled deeply, his face aging 10 years in mere seconds. "We are in debt, Isabella, a debt we cannot repay." Her mother clutched her hands, her voice barely above a whisper. "Victor Lancaster is our only option. If you marry him, everything will be settled." Victor Lancaster. The name wasn't unfamiliar. He wasn't just one of the wealthiest men in London. He was a man the entire city feared, a ruthless tycoon, a financial kingpin who could make even the most powerful families bow before him. And now she was being handed to him like a bargaining chip. "No, I won't marry a man I don't even know." Isabella shot up from her seat, fury blazing in her eyes. But her father only looked at her with quiet resignation. "You don't have a choice." The words cut through her like a blade. 3 days later, she stood before an exclusive law office, draped in a simple white wedding dress. There was no church, no music, no flowers, just a contract. Victor Lancaster was already inside, waiting for her. He was tall, dressed in a perfectly tailored black suit, his icy blue eyes locked onto her with a gaze devoid of warmth. A man who could manipulate entire markets with a single decision. Now, he had just purchased himself a wife. A lawyer placed the marriage papers before them. Isabella picked up the pen, her fingers trembling. "Sign it." Victor's voice was deep, smooth, yet sharp as steel. As the ink touched the paper, Isabella knew her life was no longer her own. The car glided through the dark streets of London, city lights flickering against the windows. Isabella sat still, her hands clenched together. She didn't look at Victor, but she could feel his overwhelming presence beside her. Victor Lancaster's estate was unlike anything she had ever seen. There was no warmth, no sense of welcome. It was a fortress of marble and glass, cold, imposing, and just like him. The car door opened. A sharp night breeze rushed in, sending a shiver down her spine. Victor said nothing, but his gaze commanded her to step out. Inside, the silence was suffocating. No greetings, no servants waiting, only the echo of her own footsteps in the vast space. Victor led her through long hallways, stopping before a set of towering wooden doors. "Your room," he said, pushing them open. It was lavish, more luxurious than any place she had ever stayed, yet an unmistakable coldness lingered in the air. Isabella turned, her voice guarded. "We have separate rooms?" Victor smirked. He stepped inside, closing the door behind her. "No, Isabella, this is our room." Her heartbeat stuttered. Victor stood near the window, the city lights casting sharp shadows over his features. He didn't touch her, didn't rush, but his silence was more suffocating than any threat. "You know why you're here." His voice was deep, each word a rope tightening around her. Isabella wanted to deny it, to scream that she didn't belong to him, but the words caught in her throat. Victor slowly turned, his piercing blue gaze sweeping over her. "You fear me." He stepped closer, and instinctively she backed away, but he only chuckled, a low, knowing sound. "But there's something even more terrifying." He lifted her chin, forcing her to meet his eyes. "You're drawn to me." Isabella froze. She wanted to protest, to pull away, but her own breath betrayed her. Her heart was pounding. Victor leaned in, his breath ghosting over her skin. "I won't force you, Isabella." His voice was low, a dark promise. "But you will come to me, soon." And then he walked away, leaving her there, her body burning, her mind in absolute chaos. Isabella couldn't sleep. The room was too big, too silent, and Victor's words still echoed in her mind. "But you will come to me, soon." She hated how he spoke, as if he had already won. She hated how her body betrayed her, how her heart raced when he was near. The next morning, she walked down the grand staircase, determined to keep as much distance from Victor as possible. But the moment she stepped into the dining room, he was already there, casually reading the newspaper. "Did you sleep well, Isabella?" His voice was calm, but laced with challenge. She pressed her lips together, trying to keep her composure. "Thank you for asking, but I don't need your fake concern." Victor lowered the paper, his icy gaze meeting hers. "I'm not pretending, Isabella. I'm just waiting to see how long it takes before you admit that you've been thinking about me." Her throat tightened. She wanted to scoff, to dismiss his words, but nothing came out. She turned to leave, but his voice stopped her mid-step. "If you're truly not thinking about me, why are you running?" Isabella froze. A surge of anger flared in her, but beneath it, something more dangerous, the sinking feeling that he was right. She spun around, eyes blazing. "You think you can manipulate me? I'm not one of your pawns, Victor." He chuckled, a deep, dark sound. Rising from his seat, he took slow, deliberate steps toward her. "I don't need to manipulate you, Isabella. Your own emotions are doing that for me." He stopped just inches away, his presence overwhelming. "Your body trembles when I come close. Your heart beats faster when I look at you and when I touch you." He lifted a hand, his fingers brushing lightly against her wrist, sending an undeniable shiver through her. "You can't hide it, Isabella. You're drawn to me." She yanked her hand away, her breath unsteady. She hated him, but what she hated even more was that he was right. Victor tilted his head slightly, his smirk filled with knowing amusement. "Run all you like, but soon you'll come to me on your own." And then he turned and walked away, leaving Isabella standing there, her emotions tangled in knots. She hated him. She feared him. But the most terrifying thing of all was that a part of her wanted to follow. Isabella couldn't run from her own emotions. She had tried to hate Victor Lancaster, tried to see him as an enemy, as the man who had stolen her freedom. But the more she resisted, the more she realized she didn't truly want to escape him. Since their confrontation in the dining room, Victor hadn't touched her, hadn't forced her into anything, but he never let her forget his presence. He was everywhere, in the lingering glances, in the controlled silence, in the sharp words that clung to her skin. He wasn't in a hurry, he was waiting. One afternoon, Isabella hid in the library, desperate to regain control over her thoughts. But then his deep, knowing voice cut through the quiet. Trying to escape through books? She stiffened, but forced herself to remain composed. She wouldn't let him see her break. "Trying to pretend you don't exist," she shot back, her tone defiant. Victor smirked. He stepped closer, unhurried, like he was savoring the game. His breath reached her before his touch did, and Isabella realized her body was betraying her mind. She hated him. But what she hated even more was the way she reacted to him. That night, Isabella stood on the balcony, the cold London air biting at her skin, but the fire inside her burned hotter. She told herself she hated him, told herself this was just a game of control. But even she no longer believed that. She felt him before she saw him. Victor emerged from the shadows, stepping closer as if he had read her thoughts. "Still thinking about running?" His voice was low, carrying that ever-present smirk. Isabella closed her eyes, drawing a deep breath. She couldn't lie to herself anymore. "No," she whispered. She opened her eyes, meeting his. "I want to stay. I want you." The words tasted foreign on her tongue, yet they felt inevitable, like a truth she had been denying for far too long. Victor's smirk vanished. His gaze darkened. No more patience, no more games. Only desire. He pulled her into his arms, his breath warm against her skin. Isabella's heart pounded wildly, but this time she didn't want to run. Victor claimed her lips, his kiss deep, possessive, undeniable. It wasn't just a kiss. It was a declaration. This was no longer a transaction. This was the surrender of two hearts. Victor's kiss wasn't just an act of possession. It was a storm, a declaration. Isabella didn't know when her arms wrapped around his neck, when her body melted into his as if she had been meant to do this all along. All she knew was that she couldn't stop. Victor lifted her effortlessly, his grip strong as if he had been waiting for this moment forever. He laid her down on the bed, but instead of rushing forward, he only looked at her, his gaze burning yet terrifyingly patient. "I told you," he murmured, his voice low and velvety, a final warning. "You would come to me on your own." Isabella swallowed hard. She could feel the heat radiating from him, could see the hunger in his eyes, but he was still waiting for her decision. No pressure, no force, only her choice. And for the first time, Isabella realized she wanted this. Not because of a contract, not because fate had led her here, but because of her. She reached up, her fingers tracing his face, soft yet certain. "I don't want to run anymore." Victor leaned down, his kiss no longer urgent. It was slow, deep, dangerously gentle, as if he was engraving this moment into his soul. And then the world disappeared. The golden light of dawn filtered through the window, casting a soft glow over the room. Isabella stirred awake, warmth enveloping her from all sides. Victor Lancaster lay beside her. She turned to look at him, studying the sharp angles of the man who had once terrified her, the man she now couldn't imagine her life without. His breathing was slow, steady. Like this, there was no coldness, no dominance, only a man who had given her his heart. She reached out, tracing a delicate finger across his jawline. Victor's brows furrowed slightly before his eyes flickered open. "Enjoying the view?" His voice was rough with sleep, teasing yet gentle. Isabella laughed. She never thought Victor Lancaster would be capable of making her laugh like this. "Maybe I'm just trying to convince myself this is real." Victor watched her silently for a moment before pulling her closer. "If you need convincing, I'd be happy to remind you." His voice was low, husky against her ear, his breath sending a dangerous shiver down her spine. Her cheeks flushed. She smacked his chest lightly, but she didn't pull away. She didn't want to. A week later, Isabella stood by the floor-to-ceiling window in Victor's office, gazing at the city of London stretching beneath them. She remembered the first time she had walked into this mansion, how she had felt alone, trapped, controlled. But now everything had changed. A strong arm wrapped around her waist, pulling her back into the warmth she had come to crave. "What are you thinking?" Victor's deep voice rumbled behind her, steady as the waves. She leaned her head against his chest, listening to the firm rhythm of his heartbeat. "That I once thought I was your prisoner," she murmured. "But the truth is, I had always been my own." Victor was quiet for a moment, then he pressed a slow, lingering kiss to her hair. "And now?" he asked. Isabella turned to face him, her gaze unwavering. "Free," she whispered. Victor held her stare, then, for the first time, he smiled, a rare smile, one meant only for her. Then he leaned down, capturing her lips in a kiss that was slow, deep, and consuming, not a possession, but a vow. Isabella had once thought Victor Lancaster could buy anything. But the most valuable thing he ever had was her love, something no amount of money could ever buy. 1 year later, Isabella sat on the balcony, her eyes drifting over the garden below. This place had once felt like a prison, a gilded cage trapping her in a forced marriage. But now it was home. The breeze carried the soft scent of white roses. She placed a gentle hand on her stomach, a quiet smile playing on her lips. Footsteps echoed behind her. "Are you hiding from me?" That deep, familiar voice made her smile. "And if I am?" she teased, not needing to turn around to know Victor was standing behind her. He stepped forward, wrapping his arms around her, his hands covering hers. "I would never let you get away from me, Isabella." She tilted her head, letting his lips brush against her neck. "I know," she murmured, her gaze soft, peaceful. Victor lowered his gaze, noticing her hand resting on her stomach. She didn't have to say a word. He already understood. His grip tightened around her, his breath catching slightly. "You are the most precious thing I've ever had," he whispered, his voice rougher than usual. Slowly, he placed his hand over hers, his touch lingering, reverent. For the first time in his life, Victor Lancaster, a man who had built empires and commanded power, felt truly powerless. Isabella smiled, her heart swelling at the raw emotion in his gaze. She had once thought she was forced to belong to Victor Lancaster. But now, she knew her heart had chosen him long ago. And this wasn't the end. This was a new beginning.